I'd ask anyone take a seat if there's one available. Otherwise, could you please silence your phone now? We're going to get ready for our final panel discussion on the future of the Middle East. I'll let Nancy Youssef take it over from here.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining us. It's a delight to be with all of you. My name is Nancy Youssef, and I'm a national security reporter for BuzzFeed News. I have spent the bulk of my reporting career out of Egypt, Libya, and Iraq, and I'm just so delighted to be a part of this panel. I'm going to start by asking our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves, and if possible, tell us the first Middle East country they have visited. And given that I'm an Egyptian American, preference will be given to those who cite anything Egypt-related. Mr. Abrams?
I can't do that. Elliot Abrams. I'm a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And the answer is Israel.
When? You know, I need to hear just...
1970.
1970. Thank you. Mr. Master?
Thanks. Ryan Crocker, a longtime Foreign Service officer, first Middle Eastern country, I assume this extends to North Africa.
Absolutely.
Was Morocco, before it was Morocco. My father was in the Air Force and I was 3 years old.
Wow.
Tamara Wittes. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and if you consider Turkey part of the Middle East, I was born in Turkey because my father was an FSO. But the first Middle Eastern country I lived in was Israel.
Jake Sullivan. I'm teaching at Yale Law School and working at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Israel is the first Middle Eastern country I've been to as well. I went there in college on a student newspaper trip.
Isn't that amazing? Well, I'd like to start by asking a broad question to all of you, because I think it's a good starting point for all of us. So we'll just go down the line if we could. I'm curious what you think is the most pressing issue before this administration in the region. And this can be in reference to a particular part of the region or a trans-regional threat.
I think the most pressing issue is Iran. Because if you look at events in the Gulf itself, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, there's a thread that ties all of these and some other things together, and that is the effort of Iran to, well, if we avoid value judgments, the effort of Iran to have a larger role in the affairs of the Middle East and to reassert a leading role in the entire region.
Mm-hmm.
I think we may be our own most pressing problem. World War I ended, the Versailles negotiations, the United States was basically missing. The British and the French didn't want us there. Woodrow Wilson was already ill, and then of course the 1918 elections returned an isolationist Congress. That in no small way produced the garden in which World War II grew, because it was just 2 decades later that the world was at war again. We played a very different role after World War II, in which we designed, in many respects, the international order. The United Nations created in San Francisco, the international financial order at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Not only did we create it, we led it. That had a lot of blood spilled on it over the years, but never a global catastrophe. Then, after the 2008 election, we started backing away from it. The slogan, "We can't fix everything," too often became an excuse not to fix anything. So there's good news and bad news here. There's continuity in some important respects between the Obama and Trump administrations. The bad news is both have questioned, really, U.S. leadership. And I will shut up in a second. If you want just a sharp and sad example of that, after World War II, ground forces in Europe had as mission identifying and assisting refugees. and in many cases getting them to the States. We are now looking at the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And again, another point of continuity between the administrations, basically not leading. As thousands die in the Mediterranean, as Europe is destabilized. So we've got to decide what we're going to do, because there is nobody ready to step up and say, we'll lead for a while. And so are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? What are the consequences if we don't?
Very interesting.
So I would agree with Ambassador Crocker that there is a big question on the table about America's role in the Middle East, and a debate that is ripening here in Washington on that question. But I think, and I agree with Elliot as well, that the challenge of Iran is a major challenge. But I would say that this growth of Iranian influence and the growth of ISIS and other non-state violent actors, these are the twin security challenges that the U.S. is facing in the region. They're both symptoms. They're symptoms of an underlying problem, which is vacuums of order and authority all over this region. Because the regional order that we defended for the previous half century broke down in 2011. And everyone is now fighting over what the next order will look like. Hence the big question about our role. So I think unless we are willing, alone with others, however, to work to close up those vacuums of order and authority, and to heal the cracks that are being exploited by ISIS and Iran, we're going to keep facing the same challenges over and over.
So it's never good to go fourth when the question is, what's the most important blank? Because either you're going to come up with some other thing, like, it's parliamentary elections in Tunisia that's the biggest problem, kind of. Or you're just going to say what they said. I'm mostly going to say what they said, especially what Tammy just said. I actually think the biggest problem in the Middle East right now, and this is a place where there are many problems, is the simple fact of 20 million Sunnis living between Iranian-dominated capitals in Baghdad and Damascus. And what is flowing from that right now is a continuing ISIS safe haven, though shrinking. And what will flow from that, even after we take both Mosul and Raqqa back from ISIS, is the son of ISIS or the cousin of ISIS, unless we come up with a bigger solution. And I agree with Ryan, that solution is very much about American will, but I think there are also real questions about capacity, because it's not clear to me that even if we were prepared to apply American power and influence at a maximum, we have the answers to that core problem of those 20 million Sunnis living in a region without economic prospects, having faced years of radicalization, where you have the overlay of a geopolitical conflict driven by malign Iranian influence. And until we can figure out what we are going to do about that problem, we are going to continue to face a terrorist threat emanating out of the region, and we are going to continue to look for Band-Aid. We'll continue to bounce from Band-Aid solution to Band-Aid solution. And we've seen already once around what happens when you roust then AQI from population centers. We ended up with ISIS, and that could very well happen again if we don't come up with solutions involving both will, but also ideas for how you get a sustainable solution to this that we have not yet developed.
It's interesting in those answers, it really kind of demands a case study about a power vacuum and this feeling that ISIS is in its final days. So Ambassador Crocker, let's go to Iraq, where you have a prime minister whose grip on the country is quite tenuous. What needs to happen so that a terror group doesn't emerge in that power vacuum within Iraq itself?
I think we're all pretty much in agreement here that Islamic State is not the problem; it is the symptom of the problem.
Right.
When I was there, we had over 150,000 troops. Couldn't finish off Al Qaeda in Iraq. We badly weakened it, but because of Sunni mistrust of the new order, they found just enough safe haven to to keep going. And then we got Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0. And as I think we're suggesting here, if all we're going to do is defeat them militarily, not too far down the line, we're going to be looking at Islamic State 3.0. How do you fix it? Really, really hard. But ignoring it hasn't made it better. When I left Iraq after 2 fun-filled years in February 2009, one of the last things I did was take a walk through the souk in Ramadi with Ahmed Abu Risha, the head of the Awakening, after his brother was assassinated. It's been a long way down since then, largely because we said, we're done. So what you got? You got Islamic State. You have Iranian-backed Shia militias with government sanction who have killed Americans, by the way. That's what you get if you decide the war's over when it isn't. So we're going to have to, again, to sit down as a nation, won't that be fun? And talk across the aisle about what we can and should do, and then bring in as many allies as we can.
Are you optimistic that that's going to happen?
Absolutely not.
Okay, good. I fear we could talk about that conflict specifically, and I want to make sure we get to other topics. So, Mr. Selva, I'm going to go to you and talk about Qatar, because there's been breaking news out of there as well. And we've had Saudi Arabia with its Gulf partners and Egypt declare its split from Qatar. This was a huge divide, one we haven't really seen among U.S. Sunni allies. And I'm curious if you could walk us through, because we haven't really heard what is it that they want to see. What is their bottom line? I'm curious what your assessment is. And how can the current administration bridge that gap between these once Sunni allies for the United States?
So, sorry, we'll figure out these microphones at some point. As many of you guys know, this is a long-standing feud between the Emiratis and Saudis, and in particular between Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the current Qatari leadership over 2 issues. Many, but 2 to distill it. One being Qatar's support for Islamist groups across the Middle East, including the Muslim Brotherhood, but certainly not limited to the Muslim Brotherhood, to Hamas, to Islamist militias in both Libya and Syria. And then second, Qatar's relationship with Iran, which is a much more complex, shall we say, that's a diplomatic term for kind of having it both ways, with Iran, compared with how the Emiratis and Saudis believe that the GCC in general, the Gulf in general, should be approaching the Iranian relationship. A couple of years ago, this flared up, and the Qataris basically made a few representations about what they would do, patch things over. But the behavior continued, and MBZ and MBS basically decided this time around we're not just going to go with some representations. We want to see real change. I do not have a good answer. I'd be curious what my fellow panelists have to say about what exactly it is that Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are looking for. I think that they are in a pretty maximalist posture right now, and that President Trump's public utterances on this topic, mainly across Twitter, are only reinforcing their maximalism. And that actually Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis, who both quietly and in some ways more publicly now over the past few days have indicated they would like to see the U.S. involved in actually de-escalating this situation, because from the American perspective, while there are things we would like the Qataris to do differently, absolutely, and we should hold their feet to the fire, we are also better off trying to make it a constructive partnership rather than a full breach. And that goes beyond just the existence of the American Air Base in Qatar. It involves a range of issues. And we are better off when our Sunni partners are working together rather than at loggerheads and cross purposes in ways that can actually be exploited by the Iranians and others in the region to our detriment. So I think the president will be well advised to let the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who have deep relationships with all of these actors, apply American influence to try to find a way to de-escalate this situation and resolve it. None of that absolves the Qataris for acts that they have undertaken in the realm of terror financing and the support for propaganda over the years that I do believe comes at the detriment to the United States, but nor does it excuse other actors in the Gulf who themselves have to look in the mirror and ask whether there's more they can do to improve the situation and reduce extremism. So this could go on for a while. It could get worse before it gets better. But I think the course for American policy is very clear.
Well, I think actually this crisis within the GCC reveals the challenge, even if the United States musters the will and resources to engage and lead in the region. This is evidence of just how complex that can be in a moment when the governments of the region feel themselves existentially challenged by this historic transformation that's underway, this upending that has occurred. And so they are all taking fairly maximalist positions because they think their own survival is at stake. The last time this blew up, this was, I think, 2014, and it was at a moment when President Obama and his team had just spent many, many months persuading the GCC to unify against ISIS, to work with us in Iraq, and President Obama was getting ready to go to Riyadh for a summit with the GCC when this exploded. This time it happened right after Trump managed to get the GCC and the broader Sunni world unified behind our core interests and our priorities in the region, ISIS and Iran. And the problem is that their interpretation of that mandate is quite different from ours, and they clearly disagree about the interpretation of that mandate. So to me, it is evidence of the fact that we can't simply push back on Iran and push back on ISIS without having the tougher conversations with our regional partners about what we intend to replace that with. What's our vision for this region? That's what I think U.S. leadership really requires. And until then, I think we are going to be subject to a lot of tugging by our partners who all have their own very different visions.
One very brief point. I've been under the assumption, I don't know because I wasn't in the room, that in fact the Emiratis and Saudis believed that they, if not had a green light from President Trump, that he would not oppose what they did, and that was an important factor in the lengths that they were prepared to go here. So I agree with you that this is complicated under any circumstances, but it is far more difficult for us to manage all of this when the president is taking the kind of approach that Trump is taking.
I agree with everything that's been said, except, but the Qataris have to stop. I mean, the Qataris have a fair amount of American blood on their hands from the Iraq War. Al Jazeera was basically urging people to kill Americans in Iraq, and they wouldn't stop. And this was tried in a more relaxed manner in 2014, and they wouldn't stop. And it's time for them to stop. And what are we talking about here? It's a country that has 250,000 citizens and a ton of money that it uses essentially to promote radicalism that is not in our interest. So, yeah, I think we want to try to massage this crisis so that it goes away. But the fundamental State Department attitude toward this, which is, let's make it go away, is not the right attitude. The right attitude is the Qataris have to stop. And we should use this moment to get them to stop supporting all of these causes that are not in our interest. Others in the region do it too. The Saudis do it. This today is about getting the Qataris, who are under pressure from their neighbors, to stop spending their money in ways that are extremely deleterious to American security interests. And I think we should be in favor of that.
Elliot, would you agree that it's not 100% congruence between our definition of what they need to stop and the Saudis and Emiratis' definition of what they need to stop?
No, but I think there is a fair amount of congruence.
2 points. If we're going to take that kind of approach, and certainly it would be a good thing in many respects if we did, we got to be prepared to leave El Udeid.
Yes.
That would be the base.
So let me just give you some ancient history now. I negotiated that agreement 15 years ago, 2002, with the then Foreign Minister, Hamid bin Jassim. The approach we took was to ask for everything, 3 kitchen sinks, everything we could think of. They would maybe whittle us down by a third, and we would still have one hell of a deal. We sent it over to the embassy. Hamid bin Jassim comes in the next morning, got the ream of paper with him, and he says, so is this everything? Is there anything else? And I kicked myself for not asking for Qatari funding for Fort Hood, Texas in perpetuity. They probably would have done it. They did not quibble over a single thing we signed, and the implicit understanding then, the Bush administration, remember, was that we got this great gift, and that would be the basis of our relationship going forward. And it, again, implicit, we'd get off their backs on Al Jazeera and other things. So, yeah, we can certainly go the way Elliot suggests, but we're going to have a plan B, because we cannot prosecute our campaigns in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria without El Udeid.
LUD, by the way, is the air base from which the majority of U.S. air operations in the war in Afghanistan and against ISIS is flown out of. And for the U.S. military, it's seen as the ideal option because the Qataris, as the ambassador spelled out, have put the least amount of restrictions on U.S. operations in the region.
It's all true, although it's also true that it is the main asset in Qatari national security. So it's not as if, they did us this huge favor and they don't get much out of it, except we don't complain about Al Jazeera. They get a lot out of it.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. I mean, in order to do what you're suggesting, we've got to be prepared to replicate Al Udeid somewhere else, and we're not going to be able to do that.
Should we move to Syria? I wanted to ask all of you, and Mr. Silva, I'm going to ask you to start. There's arguably a disconnect in the U.S. Approach to Syria. On one hand, the United States is saying we are committed only to prosecuting the war in ISIS, except in cases of self-defense, and yet we've had this week at least 2 instances in which the U.S. has shot down pro-regime or regime aircraft. And so I'm curious for you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in terms of how does this administration reconcile an Assad regime that is moving more eastward, closer to the U.S. war against ISIS? Is there a threat of an expanded U.S. involvement in Syria because of these 2 conflicts, the Syrian civil war and the U.S. war against ISIS butting up against each other? If you'll start us off, and then Ms. Abrams, you can take it from there.
So the typical thing, if you're a Democrat like me and you have a Republican administration, is just say they're screwing it all up in Syria. But I have to say, I just feel for them, honestly. I mean, this is an incredibly difficult, wicked problem. And the short answer to your question of how you resolve that contradiction is, if somebody has a clear and linear answer to that really works, please tell me, because I haven't heard it. This is going to be messy and complicated. We have known for a while now, really going back to the campaign, that President Trump's effort to say there's the Syrian civil war over here and there's the fight against ISIS over there was not a fundamentally sustainable position.
Exactly.
We have known that. We've also known that there's something inherently contradictory in prosecuting an effective war against ISIS while basically saying to Assad, Putin, and Khamenei, do whatever else you guys want to do. The administration is now learning that in spades as something unfolds that maybe they weren't fully expecting, and none of us, I think, saw it coming as quickly as it's come. Or maybe some people did. I didn't see it come this quickly, which is, as the fight for Raqqa is joined, now all of a sudden the fight for a post-Raqqa eastern Syria is joined. And it is joined by Iranian proxy forces, Syrian regime forces, and then American-backed Syrian democratic forces. Necessarily, that is going to bring us into close operating proximity to both Iranian proxy forces and Syrian regime forces, and it has resulted in what you've seen, the shooting down of drones, the shooting down of a plane, and the bombing of Iranian proxy forces on the ground. So far, that's mainly been a reactive move by the administration, and if you ask me to predict, I would say they're going to remain in a reactive posture, mostly because I don't think they've been able to develop an affirmative posture that says this is how we actually want all of this to look at the end of the day. What I believe is that what was true a year ago remains true today, that you will not solve the problem of ISIS and terrorism without solving the underlying Syrian civil war, that will mean the United States needs to put more skin in the game in order to shape some kind of diplomatic solution, however imperfect that solution might look. And that the sooner this administration comes to grips with that, the sooner they can translate that into an actual operational plan for how to deal with things in eastern Syria.
I completely agree with that analysis. I think we don't have a policy yet. We see the administration moving toward a policy, which is the realization that somebody has to govern these spaces out of which ISIS is being kicked, and we don't want it to be Syria, Russia, Hezbollah, Iran. The one optimistic part is that maybe, with more skin in the game, American skin in the game, a diplomatic negotiation becomes more realistic. My criticism of the efforts of Secretary Kerry was that he was attempting to achieve at the conference table in Geneva or Astana what we had not achieved on the battlefield, and that never works. But if it's clear that we're doing more in Syria, and we are, maybe, it will be possible to engage the Russians first in a serious negotiation. I don't think it's impossible to think of compromises that, to some decent degree, protect American and Russian interests. It's certainly going to be, as Jake says, very messy and unattractive, but I don't know that it's impossible to achieve it.
Look, you are both irrationally exuberant. The Lebanese civil war in its hot phase lasted 15 years. I know, I was there. It is far more complicated in Syria. Regional engagement, international engagement at levels that never took place in Lebanon. And remember, the Lebanon civil war only truly ended when Syrian tanks rolled into Baghdad Palace, the presidential palace, in October of 1990. Well, there are no checkbox tanks that are going to roll into the People's Palace in Damascus. So fasten your seatbelt. This is going to go on for a long, long time.
Ms. Wittes, I wanted to ask you, because you've written a lot about the need for the administration to address things like human rights, political freedoms, and the delinquency in doing that. And so I'd like both you and Mr. Abrams to address that. In terms of your viewpoint, what can we learn from the failings of the Bush and Obama administration, and where is there opportunity for this administration to push forth some of those issues in the region?
Sure. Well, look, I think if we dig into the drivers of not just the Arab uprisings of 2011, but the breakdown in regional order that we've seen since then, those drivers are largely internal to the region. That doesn't mean that the United States played no role. At various points, it played a very significant role. But the underlying drivers are demographic change, economic change, technological change in the region, leading to pressures and demands that these autocratic regimes could not or would not, or both in some cases, deal with appropriately. And so things blew up, as they do. And this is the underlying vulnerability of partnering with autocrats, is that they are not nearly as agile as we think. They are not nearly as resilient as democratic systems are to dealing with change. And the longer they're in power, especially the kind of autocratic regimes that we've seen in the Middle East that really try to control every aspect of public life, the longer they're in power, the more they degrade all the other social capital in society, so that when they go, what's left behind is pretty awful. And Libya, to me, is probably the premier example of that in the Middle East. It's not the uprising against Gaddafi that destroyed the Libyan state. It's Gaddafi that destroyed Libya. He had 42 years. He did a really good job. And we're all now dealing with the fallout. So I think, look, the United States has to work with all kinds of partners around the world, and we do. But when we're thinking about things like, where do we put a base? And what kinds of deals do we make for those long-term commitments that create mutual vulnerability? We have to think about the long-term risks. It's not enough to say, well, we need to defeat ISIS now, so we're going to or we need to do the Iraq War now, so we're going to take this deal now. When we build a base in a place like Bahrain, we get invested in the security of the Bahraini regime. And when their majority Shia population rises up against the Sunni monarchy, we then have a very, very complicated time. So
rising up looking for social reforms.
Looking for social and political reforms, looking for empowerment, looking for basic equality, and for representation, for voice. But more broadly, what I would say is that, as we talk through Iran and these security challenges, Iran is able to do so much in this region because of the cracks within these societies. It was the Lebanese civil war that gave the Iranians the opening to create what they have now, which is a veto over what happens in Lebanon. The Syrian civil war has given them an unparalleled opportunity. The conflict in Iraq, similarly. And where there are divides within these societies, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in Yemen, they find opportunities. We need to make sure that they have as few opportunities as possible. And so do the regional governments, which means, to me, there's a good quid pro quo for the U.S. and our partners. We're there. We're going to support them. We're going to push back against Iran. We're going to help stabilize the region. And they are going to do what they can to close up these cracks within their own societies, treat their people with basic decency, and include them so that Iran doesn't have such an easy time making a mess.
Because we're running low on time, I just wanted to get I have two questions, and one to Ambassador Crocker. One of the things we've seen in the recent weeks is that the president has given more authorities to the Pentagon to determine troop levels in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, and since you've been ambassador to all three, I'm curious, from your perspective, having the Pentagon have that much say over the conduct of war, how does that affect the overall mission? How does that affect diplomacy? What are some things we should be looking for going forward in light of this delegation?
In 30 seconds.
Well, first, just yes about my past assignments. I truly got the trifecta from Helen. Look, Secretary Mattis is one of the real stars in the cabinet. He knows how the region works. He's a very thoughtful individual. And I know he knows that what this isn't is a delegation of the Commander-in-Chief's authority. That is not delegable. It frees Secretary Mattis and his generals, though, within an established policy framework and at a tactical level to be able to ebb and flow forces as he sees are necessary. But if he gets anywhere near a strategic shift, he's going to be right over there at the White House laying it out, because only the president can make those kinds of decisions. And of course, H.R. McMaster knows this up and down as well. So I'm quite comfortable with it. You're not going to have a rogue general out there carrying off into the night. That's not his style, and that's not the way our system works.
I just want to add, actually, something to what Tammy Wittes said. When we think about the promotion of democracy and human rights, think about it from a realist and not just moralist point of view. Tyrannies are not good at defeating ISIS because Islamist extremism is an idea, and policemen can't defeat it, and soldiers can't defeat it. They are critical to the battle, but ultimately it needs to be defeated with other, better ideas. And illegitimate governments that rule by brute force are never going to be able to defeat it, and they don't even try. As you were saying, if you look at Mubarak, and I'll just stop with this, he didn't crush the Muslim Brotherhood. He didn't want to crush the Muslim Brotherhood, because then he couldn't come to the Americans and say, It's me or the Muslim Brotherhood. So if we're serious about defeating Islamist extremism, we need to be serious about the police efforts and the military efforts. We need to be equally serious about political reform in the region that addresses the grievances that really do rightly exist among the people of the region.
I completely agree with that, and I thought that was something I would never say to you.
Well, given that optimistic note, I wanted to ask all of you as a final question. You know, I worry when we have panels on the Middle East that we can leave quite pessimistic about the world ahead. So I'm going to ask all of you, and whoever wants to jump in, what are you optimistic about the region right now? Anybody?
Well, maybe I'll start. I have to be, because otherwise I would
Pivot to Asia.
Yes, pivot to Asia. But one of the things I loved about the job I had at the State Department working for Jake and Secretary Clinton is that I was in charge of a program that supported civil society organizations around the region. We did a lot of work with young people, and this is a region that is overwhelmingly young. A country like Saudi Arabia, half the population are kids, okay? And doing those site visits, going around the region and realizing that this is a healthier, better educated, more connected generation of young Arabs than this region has ever seen. They have incredible aspirations for themselves, for their communities, for their countries. They have creativity. They have energy. They need space. They need platforms on which to realize those dreams. And, you know, when you create those platforms, you can see it emerge. So there's a lot of talk right now in the region about entrepreneurship, because that is one platform that governments will allow, but it's not the only one. So the young people give me hope.
I would just come in on top of that. That's exactly right. That is the difference. I was in Baghdad about a year ago, had a meeting with university students and recent graduates there at the Prime Minister's guest house, and they were they just ripped into the establishment. Totally corrupt from the Prime Minister on down. This has got to be utterly changed if we're going to get anywhere as a state, and on in this vein. And I said, you do realize you're actually sitting here in the Prime Minister's guest house, basically calling him a corrupt crook. And they said, yeah, so what? You don't see this in the region. You certainly didn't see it in Iraq. And the same thing's going on in Afghanistan.
Well, I love ending on such an optimistic note, and I can't believe how much of the region we covered in such a short period of time. So I want to thank my wonderfully esteemed panel for such a lively and enlightening discussion, and please join me in thanking them.